The first thing Sergeant David Corell became aware of was the sound of his own breathing. It came in short, ragged pulls, too loud inside the sealed neurohelmet, as if someone had turned the volume of his own existence all the way up. The second thing he became aware of was the heat. It was everywhere. Not the familiar warmth of a cockpit after sustained weapons fire. That manageable bloom that every MechWarrior learned to live with. This was something else entirely. This was the heat of a world that had torn itself open. He blinked. His eyes stung. The primary monitor was cracked down the center, a jagged lightning bolt of fracture splitting the heads-up display into two useless halves. The secondary screens were dark. The tertiary backup, a small square display bolted to the left of his command couch that most mech warriors forgot existed, flickered with pale amber text, scrolling damage reports in a font so small he had to squint to read it. He did not want to read it. Outside the ferroglass viewport, there was nothing, not darkness, not light, just gray. A thick, impenetrable gray, like someone had poured wet concrete over the canopy. Ash, volcanic ash, pressed against his Warhammer's cockpit in a suffocating blanket. He could hear it ticking against the armored glass, a constant, gentle percussion, like the fingernails of something patient. Davi closed his eyes and tried to remember. They had been advancing through the Kalos Rift, a volcanic lowland on the southern continent of Lockton 4. 12 mechs of Corell's Cavaliers, a small mercenary company contracted by House Davion to secure a mining installation that Capellan raiders had been hitting for the better part of 3 months. It was supposed to be a straightforward contract, garrison duty with teeth. The volcanic activity in the region had been classified as dormant by the Planetary Survey, the kind of word that geologists used when they meant it probably safe. But we are not staking our reputations on it. The geologists had been wrong. The eruption had come without warning. One moment, Davi had been watching his lance's formation through his rear camera as they crossed a flat basalt plain between two ridgelines. The next, the world had simply ended. The ground had split open in a line nearly a kilometer long, vomiting a wall of superheated gas and rock that had swallowed the sky. He remembered the shockwave hitting his 70-ton Warhammer like a giant's palm, shoving the mech sideways. He remembered his gyro screaming as it tried to compensate. He remembered the temperature gauge spiking into the red so fast the needle had seemed to teleport. And then there had been a sound, a deep, primal roar that he felt in his teeth, and his bones, and his marrow. And after that, nothing. Until now. He opened his eyes. The tertiary display was still scrolling. He forced himself to read it. Structural integrity, 51%. The Warhammer's internal skeleton had held, mostly, but the left torso had taken catastrophic damage. Whether from the shockwave or from debris, something had caved in the armor plating on that side like a crushed can. The display listed 17 separate armor breaches across the mech's body. Left arm actuator, destroyed. Right leg actuator, degraded. Gyro, functional but operating outside normal parameters. Reactor, online. That last one surprised him. The Vox 280 fusion reactor, at the heart of his WHM-6R was still burning, still feeding power to the Mech systems. That reactor had been built to survive almost anything, and it had. But the next line made his stomach drop. Coolant system. Critical failure. Primary coolant loop. Severed. Secondary coolant loop. Severed. Emergency coolant reserve. 14%. And falling. He stared at those words for a long time. A warhammer ran hot under the best of circumstances. That was the machine's defining sin. The price you paid for carrying 2 Donal particle projector cannons, a pair of Martel medium lasers, 2 Magnus small lasers, a pair of machine guns, and a Holly SR. M6 on a chassis that only mounted 18 heat sinks. Every MechWarrior who had ever piloted the WHM-6R knew the dance. Fire the PPCs, watch the heat climb, stagger your shots, keep moving, find water if you can. It was a mech that punished carelessness and rewarded discipline. With no coolant system, discipline would not matter. Without coolant circulating through the heat sinks, the waste heat from the fusion reactor alone would begin building inside the cockpit. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, the way water fills a sinking boat. The reactor could not be shut down without killing all mech systems, making his heat-addled mind fear he would be sealed inside a 70-ton coffin with no way to open the hatch. The emergency coolant reserve would buy him time. 14%, maybe an hour, maybe less, depending on how much heat the external environment was adding. And the external environment was adding a great deal. Davi pulled up the external temperature reading. The sensor was damaged, but it was still reporting. The ambient temperature outside the Warhammer's hull was 112 degrees Celsius. The volcanic eruption had turned the Kalos rift into an oven. Superheated ash, pyroclastic residue, and volcanic gases had transformed the landscape into something that belonged on a planet much closer to its star. His cockpit temperature was already 49 degrees and climbing. He was being cooked alive, slowly, but with absolute certainty. Davi unclasped his cooling vest and checked the connections. The vest was supposed to circulate coolant from the mech system directly against his skin, the last line of defense between a MechWarrior and heat death. The vest's indicator light was amber, functioning, but running on the same dying reserve as the rest of the cooling system. When that reserve hit zero, the vest would become just another layer of insulation, trapping his own body heat against him. He wiped sweat from his forehead with a gloved hand. His glove came away dark with moisture. Think, he told himself. Think, Davi. The first priority was movement. He had to get out of the Kalos rift, away from the volcanic zone, toward cooler ground. The mining installation they had been contracted to protect was roughly 30 kilometers to the northeast. If the eruption had not destroyed it, if the terrain was passable, if his crippled warhammer could even walk. He tried the controls. The command couch responded to his inputs, and through the neuro helmet, he felt the familiar neural feedback of the mech's myomor musculature engaging. The right leg moved, sluggish, grinding, But it moved. The left leg followed, and the warhammer lurched forward with a groan of tortured metal that he felt through the soles of his boots. The gyro whined in protest, fighting to keep 70 tons of damaged war machine upright on uneven ground. He took a step, then another. The ash outside was deep, at least a meter, maybe more. Each step required the warhammer to drag its feet through a gray morass that clung and sucked at the mech's legs like quicksand. The effort sent a spike through the heat gauge. The myoma muscles that drove the mech's limbs generated heat when they worked. Under normal operations, that heat was managed by the coolant system. Now, every step added to the furnace. Davi watched the cockpit temperature tick from 49 to 50.2 in the time it took him to walk 20 meters. He stopped. Standing still was death. Walking was faster death. Firing his weapons would be death with an exclamation point. Each of the Dommel PPCs generated a massive amount of waste heat when fired. And even the medium lasers and the Holly 6-rack short-range missile launcher, mounted in his torso, would push the reactor toward emergency shutdown. He was a heavily armed MechWarrior who could not afford to shoot. The irony was not lost on him. He started walking again, slower this time, trying to find the minimum effort that would keep him moving without spiking the temperature. The warhammer plodded forward through the ash like a wounded animal, each step deliberate and careful. The viewport showed nothing but gray. The ash was still falling, not the explosive torrent of the initial eruption, but a steady, silent rain of fine particles that reduced visibility to perhaps 30 meters. Beyond that, the world dissolved into a featureless void. It was quiet. That was the worst part. After the apocalyptic violence of the eruption, the silence was obscene. No wind, no rumbling, no distant sounds of combat or rescue. Just the soft hiss of ash against his hull and the rhythmic thud of his mech's footsteps, muffled and flat in the dead air. It was like walking through a world that had been erased. Davi tried his communication system. The primary transmitter was dead. The backup produced nothing but a thick wall of static. The atmosphere choked with particulate matter and ionized gases that turned every frequency into white noise. He cycled through the channels anyway, speaking into the static, his voice sounding strange and small in the heated cockpit. "This is Cavalier 1 to any Cavalier unit. Does anyone copy? Cavalier 1 to any station. I am mobile and heading northeast, requesting immediate response on any frequency." Nothing. He tried again and again. The static hissed back at him like the breathing of something vast and indifferent. He was alone. The thought settled into him like a stone dropping into deep water. 12 mechs had entered Bacallos Rift. 12 mech warriors. People he had fought beside for years. Kara Ostergaard and her Shadow Hawk, always complaining about the food on their dropship. Tomasz Breda and his Centurion, the man who could make anyone laugh with his terrible impressions of Lyran officers. Old Henriksen, who had been piloting his battered rifleman since before Davi was born. All of them swallowed by the earth. He could not think about that. Not now. Grief was a luxury that required survival. and survival was not guaranteed. At the 30-minute mark, the cockpit temperature had reached 54 degrees. Davy had covered perhaps 2 kilometers, a crawling pace that would have been humiliating under any other circumstance. The ashfall had thinned slightly, and visibility had improved to maybe 50 meters, though the world beyond that range remained a wall of gray haze. The terrain was flat and featureless, a plain of ash so uniform that it was impossible to judge distance or direction without instruments. His compass was working at least, and he kept the warhammer pointed northeast, trusting the magnetic reading even as everything else failed. He was reaching for his water bottle, mounted in a bracket beside the command couch, when the sensor panel chirped. It was a small sound, a single electronic note, almost apologetic, as if the machine was embarrassed to bother him. But it sent ice through his veins despite the heat, because he knew what that sound meant. The thermal sensors had detected something. He looked at the display. The thermal imaging system was severely degraded, its range cut to perhaps 500 meters by the ash and heat distortion. But there, at the edge of its detection envelope, was a contact. A small thermal signature, moving, it appeared, for perhaps 3 seconds, a pale ghost on the orange and red canvas of the superheated landscape, and then it was gone. Davy stared at the screen. His hand had stopped halfway to the water bottle. Sweat ran down his neck and pooled in the hollow of his collarbone. The signature reappeared. Same bearing, roughly 400 meters to his southeast. It was moving parallel to him, matching his course. Then it faded again, swallowed by the thermal noise of the environment. Something was out there. His mind raced through the possibilities. It was too small to be one of his own company's mechs. The signature was compact, low to the ground, and it moved fast when it moved. A light mech, 20, maybe 25 tons. The Capellan raiders they had been hunting had fielded a mixed lance of light and medium mechs, hit-and-run specialists, who struck the mining convoys and vanished before the garrison could respond. Intelligence had identified at least 2 locusts among them, and possibly a spider, a survivor like him. Another mech that had been far enough from the eruption's epicenter to avoid total destruction, limping through the same gray hell. But not friendly. Davy's throat tightened. He watched the sensor display, waiting for the contact to appear again. Seconds passed. 10, 20, 30. The screen showed nothing but the ambient thermal wash of the volcanic terrain. Then, almost a full minute later, the chirp sounded again. The contact was there. Same distance, same bearing, still paralleling him. It was following him. He understood then, with a clarity that cut through the heat and the fear and the grief, exactly what was happening. The enemy pilot had survived the eruption in a light mech, fast enough and nimble enough to have outrun the worst of the pyroclastic flow. That pilot had found Davy's warhammer on sensors and was now shadowing him through the ash. And that pilot was smart. Smart enough to recognize what a warhammer with coolant failure meant. The enemy did not need to fight him. The enemy just needed to wait. A warhammer at full capacity was a terrifying opponent for any light mech. 2 PPCs could core a locust in a single volley. Even the medium lasers would be devastating against light armor. Under normal circumstances, no scout pilot in the right mind would engage a heavy mech alone. But these were not normal circumstances. The enemy could see, probably on their own sensors, that the warhammer was damaged. The way it moved, the halting gait, the slow speed. Maybe they could even detect the heat bloom from the failing coolant system. The warhammer running hotter than it should be, even while just walking. The enemy knew, and the enemy had made a calculation that was as cold and logical as a targeting computer. Do not engage, do not provoke, just follow. Stay in the ash, stay at the edge of sensor range, and wait. Wait for the heat to build. Wait for the reactor to start its emergency shutdown sequence. Wait for the warhammer to go still and dark, a 70-ton statue in the ash, and then move in at leisure. It was brilliant, it was patient, and it was absolutely terrifying. Davy forced himself to take a drink of water. It was warm, almost hot, and it did nothing to cool him. The cockpit was 56 degrees now. His flight suit was soaked through. The neuro helmet felt like a band of hot iron around his skull. He had to think. He had to outthink the ghost in the gray. His weapons were useless. Not because they did not work. The tertiary display showed that both PPCs was still operational, and the right torso medium laser was functional. Even the SRM launcher had 4 rounds remaining. He had enough firepower to destroy a light mech several times over, but firing any of those weapons would generate heat that his crippled cooling system could not handle. A single PPC shot would spike the reactor temperature so high that emergency shutdown would be almost instantaneous. Both PPCs together would guarantee it. Even the medium laser would push him dangerously close to the edge. He was a man holding a loaded gun in a room full of gasoline. He could kill his enemy, but the act of pulling the trigger would kill him too. The enemy knew this. The enemy was counting on it. Davy kept walking. The ash crunched beneath his warhammer's feet, a sound transmitted through the mech's structure as a dull, rhythmic compression. Step, pause, step, pause. The gyro whined on every stride, the damaged mechanism struggling to maintain balance on the uneven, ash-covered terrain. He kept his speed as low as possible, trying to minimize the myoma heat generation. But even at a walking pace, the temperature crept upward. 57 degrees. The emergency coolant reserve was at 9%. He cycled through his sensor modes again, looking for the contact. The thermal display was a mess of false returns. The superheated ground, creating mirages and phantom signatures that bloomed and faded like hallucinations. But the real contact was there. He caught it again, just for a moment, 450 meters to the southeast. It had drifted slightly farther away, testing the range, probing, figuring out exactly how far it could stay and still keep track of him. Davy imagined the enemy pilot in their cockpit. Were they calm? Were they afraid? Were they sweating in the same heat, watching their own temperature gauge with the same sick dread? Light mechs ran cooler than heavies as a rule. A locust carried very little in the way of heat-generating weapons, and its engine, while powerful for its size, produced modest waste heat. The enemy was probably uncomfortable, but not dying. Not yet. He imagined the enemy watching him on their sensors. A big, hot, slow-moving target, a wounded animal trailing blood. "Come on then," Davi muttered to the gray haze. "Come and take your shot." But the enemy would not. That was the whole point. The minutes stretched. Time became elastic in the heat, expanding and contracting in ways that defied the clock on his tertiary display. He walked. The ash fell. The temperature climbed. 58 degrees. 59. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, and he recognized the early signs of heat exhaustion. Elevated heart rate, confusion, a strange, floaty detachment, as if his mind was beginning to separate from his body. He drank more water. He poured some over his head, inside the neural helmet, and the brief shock of lukewarm moisture against his scalp was almost enough to make him cry. The sensor chirped again. The contact was closer. 370 meters. The enemy was tightening the circle. Davi's hands clenched on the control sticks. His right thumb rested on the PPC trigger. He could feel the weapon's readiness through the neural link, a faint electric potential, like a word on the tip of a tongue. One squeeze, one shot. At 370 meters, even through the ash, the PPC's coherent particle beam would find its target with reasonable accuracy. The Donald PPC had an effective range that could reach much further than that. He could kill the ghost with a single pull. And then his reactor would spike. The heat sinks, already overwhelmed, would be unable to absorb the massive thermal output of the weapon. The fusion reactor's safety systems would engage, shutting down the engine to prevent a meltdown. His warhammer would go dark. No power, no life support, no cooling, sealed inside the cockpit in 60-degree heat, with the temperature still climbing from the volcanic environment. He would have perhaps 20 minutes before he lost consciousness, 30 before he died. He took his thumb off the trigger. The enemy faded back to 400 meters, as if it had sensed his moment of temptation and retreated from it. Or perhaps it had just been the ash, the thermal signature appearing to shift as the particles drifted between them. Davy kept walking. At the 1-hour mark, the emergency coolant reserve hit 5%. The cockpit was 61 degrees. His cooling vest had stopped functioning entirely, its tiny reservoir exhausted. The vest was now just a damp weight against his chest, doing nothing. He had finished his water. His lips were cracked, and when he licked them, the salt of his own sweat stung like acid. The ash had thinned further. Visibility was up to perhaps 70 meters, and through the gray haze he could make out the vague shapes of terrain features. Rocks. A shallow ridge to the north. The ground was rising slightly, which meant he was moving out of the rift's lowest point, climbing toward the plateau where the mining installation sat. If the installation was still there. If the eruption had not swallowed it. 30 kilometers had become 28. At his pace, that was another 14 hours of walking. He would not last 2. He needed a new plan. The sensor chirped. The contact was there again, 350 meters to his southeast. Closer still. The enemy was growing bolder, or growing impatient, or simply matching the improvement in visibility by tightening the radius. Through the ash, Davi thought he saw something. A flicker of movement, low and quick, like a bird darting between branches. But it was gone before he could focus on it. Swallowed by the gray. A locust. He was almost certain now. The movement profile, the compact thermal signature, the speed, the LCT. 1V was the most common variant in this era. A 20-ton scout mech, armed with a medium laser and a pair of machine guns. Fast, fragile, and completely outmatched by a warhammer in any fair fight. This was not a fair fight. Davi stopped walking. The warhammer stood motionless in the ash, its scarred and battered hull streaked with gray deposits. He stared at the sensor display and tried to think through the fog of heat that was settling over his mind. He could not outrun the enemy. A locust was one of the fastest mechs ever produced, capable of speeds that his damaged warhammer could not begin to approach. He could not outlast the enemy. His cooling system was failing, and every minute brought him closer to shutdown. He could not call for help. His communications were dead. He could not shoot the enemy without killing himself. Every option was a dead end. Every path led to the same destination. Unless he changed the rules. The thought came to him slowly, rising through the heat like a bubble through tar. He turned it over in his mind, examining it from different angles, looking for the flaw that would make it impossible. He found several, but impossible was a relative term when the alternative was certain death. He started walking again, but he changed his course. Instead of northeast, he turned due north toward the shallow ridge he had spotted through the ash. The warhammer plodded forward, its damaged leg actuator grinding with every step. The heat gauge ticked upward, 62 degrees. The sensor showed the enemy adjusting, swinging north to match his new heading. Still 400 meters, still shadowing, patient as a vulture. The ridge grew closer. Through the thinning ash, Davi could see it more clearly now. A natural formation of basalt, pushed up from the volcanic substrate millions of years ago. Maybe 15 meters high. The eruption had buried its base in ash, but the upper portion was still exposed, dark rock against the gray sky. And there, at the ridge's base, half hidden by the ash deposits, was what he had been hoping to find. A crevice, a gap in the rock, wide enough for a mech to wedge into, but narrow enough to provide cover on both flanks. A natural choke point. Davi guided his warhammer toward it. His heart was hammering now, and not just from the heat. The plan was simple. Simple plans were usually the best kind, because there were fewer things that could go wrong. But in this case, even the simple things were complicated by the fact that executing the plan might kill him just as surely as doing nothing. He reached the ridge and backed the warhammer into the crevice. The mech's broad shoulders scraped against the basalt walls, and he heard the screech of armor against stone transmitted through the cockpit structure. The fit was tight, but it worked. The warhammer stood wedged into the rock, facing outward, with its flanks and rear protected by solid stone. The only approach was from the front, a narrow channel of ash-covered ground, perhaps 40 meters wide, leading straight to his mech's weapons. He was turning a disadvantage into a trap. The Locust was fast. In open terrain, it could circle him, stay at range, choose when and where to engage. In this choke point, speed meant nothing. The only way to approach him was head-on, through a kill zone that even a damaged warhammer could dominate. But the enemy would not approach. That was the problem. The enemy did not need to approach. The enemy just needed to wait. So Davi needed to give the enemy a reason to come closer. He stared at the heat gauge. 63 degrees. Emergency coolant at 3%. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the reactor's safety systems initiated automatic shutdown. 30 minutes of power. 30 minutes of life support. After that, the cockpit would become a sealed metal box in a volcanic wasteland, and he would die gasping in the dark. 30 minutes. That was what he had to work with. He reached up and began to disconnect his neurohelmet. The latches were hot to the touch, and his fingers fumbled with them, clumsy with heat and exhaustion. The helmet came free with a click, and he lifted it off his head. The air hit his sweat-soaked hair and face, and it was not cool, not even slightly, but the relief of removing the helmet's weight and pressure was enormous. He set the helmet on the command couch beside him and looked at the sensor display. The contact was there, 380 meters to the south. Stationary, the enemy had stopped when he stopped. Watching, waiting, wondering what he was doing. Good. Let them wonder. Davi reached for the reactor controls. His hand hovered over the manual override panel. Under normal operations, a MechWarrior never touched these controls. The fusion reactor was managed by automated systems that regulated fuel flow, plasma containment, and heat distribution. Manual override was for emergencies, for desperate measures. He was well past desperate. The plan was this. He would reduce the reactor output to its absolute minimum, just enough to keep the cockpit sealed and the sensors running. This would slow the heat buildup, buying him additional time. Then he would vent the remaining emergency coolant, not through the heat sinks, which were already saturated, but through the cockpit's environmental system, directly cooling the air he was breathing. It was a wasteful, inefficient use of the coolant, but it would keep him conscious longer. And then he would wait, and he would watch, and he would pray that the enemy made a mistake. He executed the first part of the plan. The reactor output dropped, and the warhammer's systems dimmed. The lights in the cockpit flickered and went to emergency levels, a dull red glow that turned everything the color of old blood. The mech's weapons went to standby, their power feeds reduced to a trickle. He kept the sensors active, the compass and the cockpit life support. Everything else, the targeting computer, the secondary screens, even the damage display, went dark. The heat gauge slowed its climb. 63.4. 63.6. Still rising, but slower. He had bought himself time. Maybe another 20 minutes on top of the 30. Maybe less. He rerouted the emergency coolant to the cockpit vents. A faint breath of cooler air kissed his face, and he closed his eyes and let it wash over him. It was not cold. It was barely below the ambient cockpit temperature. But it was enough. For now, the sensor chirped. The contact had moved. Closer. 300 meters. Davi opened his eyes. The enemy was testing the new situation. The Warhammer had stopped moving, had backed into a defensive position, had reduced its power output. From the outside, it probably looked like the mech was shutting down. Like the end was beginning. The enemy was coming to check. 300 meters was still too far. Through the ash at that range, a PPC shot would be uncertain at best. He needed the enemy closer. Much closer. Close enough that even a single hasty shot from a heat-blind MechWarrior in a failing mech could not miss. He sat in the red-lit cockpit and watched the sensor display with the fixed intensity of a man watching a fuse burn. The contact drifted. 280 meters, then back to 300, then 270. The enemy was dancing, advancing and retreating, probing the situation like a surgeon probing a wound. Come on, Davi thought. Come on, you cautious bastard. Come and see. 250 meters. The contact held there for a long time. A minute. 2. The ash continued to fall. But it was thinner now, and through the viewport, Davi could see further than he had since the eruption. The gray haze was lifting, slowly, and the landscape was revealing itself. A flat, ash-covered plain stretching to the south, dotted with the dark shapes of half-buried rocks. And there, at the very edge of his vision, a shape that did not belong to the landscape. He saw it for only a second. A low, angular silhouette, moving from right to left behind a mound of ash. Fast, fluid. The distinctive profile of a locust. Its reverse-jointed legs giving it that peculiar, insectile gait that had earned the mech its name. Then it was gone, hidden again behind the terrain. But in that second, Davi felt something shift inside him. The enemy was no longer an abstract threat, a blip on a sensor display. The enemy was real, a machine, a pilot, a person who was trying to kill him through patience and mathematics. He could work with real. The coolant was almost gone, 2%. The reactor temperature was 65 degrees in the cockpit, and still climbing despite his conservation measures. His vision was tunneling, the edges going dark, and he recognized this as the beginning of heat stroke. His body was running out of ways to cool itself. Soon, his core temperature would rise past the point of no return, and his organs would begin to fail. He had minutes, not hours. Minutes. The sensor chirped. 200 meters. Davi's hand moved to the weapons panel, slowly, quietly, as if the enemy could hear him inside his own cockpit. He brought the right arm PPC back to full power. Just one. Not both. One PPC. One shot. The weapon's capacitors began to charge, drawing power from the reactor. He felt the heat immediately, a new wave rolling through the cockpit like an opened oven door. The temperature jumped to 67 degrees. He gritted his teeth and held the weapon at ready. The contact on the sensor display was moving again, drifting left, circling to the west. The enemy was trying to get an angle on him, to see around the rocks that flanked his position. At 200 meters, the Locust pilot was probably straining to see through the ash, trying to confirm visually what their sensors were telling them. Is the Warhammer shutting down? Is the pilot dead? Is it safe? Come closer, just a little closer. 180 meters. The contact paused. Davi held his breath. The heat was a physical weight now, pressing on his chest, squeezing his lungs. Sweat dripped from his chin onto his hands. The PPC trigger was slick under his thumb. 150 meters. The Locust was moving again, faster now, darting forward in a quick sprint, and then stopping. The classic scout approach. Rush, freeze, observe, rush again. The pilot was good, careful, professional. But the pilot was also making a mistake. The pilot was coming head-on into the choke point. 100 meters. Through the viewport, Davi saw it. The Locust emerged from the ash like a phantom, its low-slung body and backward-bent legs moving with a smooth, predatory grace. It was smaller than he remembered. A 20-ton machine looked almost fragile next to the rocks and terrain features surrounding it. A greyhound in a world built for mastiffs. Its armor was scorched and pitted from the eruption. One of its machine gun mounts on the left arm visibly damaged, but it moved well. The pilot had kept the mech in fighting shape. The Locust stopped. It stood in the ash, perhaps 90 meters from the crevice where Davi's warhammer was wedged. And for a long moment, nothing happened. The two mechs faced each other through the falling ash, the wounded heavy and the patient scout, the hunter and the hunted. Davy could imagine the enemy pilot staring at his warhammer, reading the damage, the darkened cockpit, the powered-down systems. The enemy was making a decision. The final decision. Was it safe to approach? Was the warhammer truly dying? He needed the enemy to believe it was. Davy let out a long, shuddering breath, and then he did something that went against every instinct he had. He powered down the PPC. The weapon's capacitors discharged with a faint whine, and the heat bloom in the cockpit eased slightly. On the enemy's sensors, the PPC's energy signature would have just vanished. To the Locust pilot, it would look like the Warhammer's weapons had finally lost power, like the end had come. He sat in the dark cockpit, in the hellish heat, and he waited. His hand did not leave the weapons panel. His thumb rested on the activation switch, not the trigger. The switch that would bring the PPC back to full charge in a fraction of the time it took to power up from cold. 5 seconds passed. The Locust moved. It took a step forward, then another. It was approaching now. Not with the cautious probing of before, but with the deliberate confidence of a predator that smells blood. 80 meters. 70. The medium laser mounted on the Locust's center torso would be in optimal range now, and Davi was painfully aware that even a medium laser could do terrible things to a warhammer with 17 armor breaches. 60 meters. The Locust was fully visible now, and he could see every detail. The scarred armor, the Confederation insignia on its left leg, barely visible under the ash. The dark eye of the medium laser pointing at him like an accusation. 50 meters. Davi hit the activation switch. The PPC came alive with a scream of charging capacitors. The heat slammed into him like a wall, and his vision went white at the edges. He did not aim through the targeting computer, because the targeting computer was offline. Stripped of his neural connection, the mech felt dead and sluggish around him. But he aimed through the viewport, through his own two burning eyes, at the shape of the Locust that filled his field of vision like a target painted by God. He pulled the trigger. The Donal PPC fired. A bolt of azure lightning erupted from the Warhammer's right arm, a searing lance of charged particles that crossed the 50 meters between the two mechs in an instant. At that proximity, he was inside the PPC's minimum range, but even with the weapons field inhibitor fighting his aim, the target filled his viewport enough to compensate for his blurred vision and shaking hands. The bolt struck the Locust square in the heavily damaged center torso. At 50 meters, the PPC's full destructive potential was focused into an area barely larger than a dinner plate. The Locust's armor, never thick to begin with on a 20-ton mech, ceased to exist in the point of impact. The particle beam punched through the standard armor plating, through the internal structure, through the engine shielding, and into the heart of the Scout Mech's fusion reactor. The Locust came apart. There was no dramatic explosion. Fusion reactors did not detonate like bombs. The reactor's containment failed, and the superheated plasma vented through the breach in the armor, consuming the mech's internal structure in a cascade of thermal destruction. The Locust seemed to melt from the inside, its legs buckling as the myoma muscles lost cohesion, its torso sagging as the skeleton warped and failed. It collapsed into the ash in a heap of glowing metal, and then it was still, and the only sound was the hiss of superheated debris cooling in the volcanic air. Davi did not see most of this. His vision had gone dark after he pulled the trigger, the heat spike driving his cockpit temperature past 70 degrees in an instant. He felt the command couch pressing against his back. He felt the heat. He felt a distant, fading awareness that the reactor's emergency shutdown sequence had begun. Alarms sounding in the red darkness, and then there was nothing. He came back to consciousness sometime later. He did not know how long it could have been, minutes or hours. The cockpit was dark and silent. The reactor was offline. No power, no lights, no life support. But he was alive. The heat was still terrible, but it was not getting worse. With the reactor shut down, there was no new heat being generated inside the mech. The cockpit temperature was stabilizing, balanced between the residual warmth of the systems and the slow bleed of thermal energy through the Warhammer's hull. It was still hot enough to kill him, but the killing would be slower now. The clock had changed. He needed to get out. The cockpit hatch was above and behind his head. An armored panel designed to be open from the inside even without power. Davi found the manual release handle in the dark, a cold metal lever that he gripped with both hands. He pulled. The mechanism resisted, heat expansion having warped the seal. He pulled harder, putting everything he had into it, and felt the handle give with a metallic crack. The hatch swung open, and the air of the outside world flooded in. It was hot. Of course it was hot, but it was different from the cockpit's trapped, recycled atmosphere. This air moved. It carried the acrid smell of volcanic ash and sulfur and scorched metal, and it was the most wonderful thing Davi had ever breathed. He climbed out of the cockpit, his movements slow and clumsy, his body operating on reserves he did not know he had. He slid down the Warhammer's hull, his boots finding purchase on the ash-covered armor, and half climbed, half fell to the ground. The ash was deep and soft, and it cushioned his landing as he collapsed onto his hands and knees. He stayed there for a long time, breathing, just breathing. When he finally looked up, the world had changed. The ash fall had nearly stopped, and the sky was visible a sickly yellow-gray dome that gave the landscape a jaundiced, feverish quality. The Kalos Rift stretched out around him, transformed into an alien wasteland of ash dunes and half-buried rock formations. Steam rose from fissures in the ground, and the air shimmered with residual heat. It looked like the surface of a dead world. It looked like the end of everything. To the south, 50 meters away, the remains of the Locust glowed faintly in the ash, a twisted sculpture of melted metal and scorched composites. The enemy pilot was dead. Had to be. Nothing could have survived the reactor breach at that range. Davi stared at the wreckage and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just the vast, empty numbness of a man who has survived something he should not have. He turned northeast. The mining installation was still 28 kilometers away. 28 kilometers of ash and heat and volcanic terrain, on foot, with no water and no communications, and the early stages of heat stroke already clouding his mind. He started walking. The ash was ankle deep and shifted under his boots with every step. The air temperature was still over 100 degrees at ground level, though it felt cooler than the cockpit by comparison. The sulfur smell was stronger out here, a sharp, chemical tang that stung his nostrils and throat. He breathed through his mouth and tried to keep a steady pace. After perhaps a kilometer, he found a rock formation that provided shade, a small overhang of basalt that the eruption had not managed to bury. He crawled under it and lay on his back, staring up at the dark stone inches above his face. The shade was not cool, but it was less hot, and his body recognized the difference with a gratitude that felt almost religious. He allowed himself to think about the enemy pilot. Who had they been? A Capellan soldier, obviously. A scout pilot, probably young, probably skilled. To have survived the eruption in a light mech. Someone who had made a cold, rational decision to stalk a wounded heavy mech and wait for it to die. Someone who had been good at their job. Not good enough. Davi thought about Kara Ostergaard and her Shadowhawk. He thought about Thomas Breda and his terrible impressions. He thought about old Henriksen. and the rifleman that the old man had treated like a beloved, cantankerous horse. He thought about the other 8 MechWarriors of Corell's Cavaliers, their faces and voices, and habits and complaints. Gone. All of them. Buried under meters of ash and volcanic debris, entombed in their cockpits, their mechs becoming their coffins. He was the last Cavalier, the sole survivor of a company that had existed for 11 years, that had fought on a dozen worlds, that had earned a reputation for reliability and professionalism, that had made them attractive to House Davion's contracting officers. 11 years, 12 mechs, 12 lives, ended by a geological event that no amount of training or firepower could have prevented. The grief hit him then, under the basalt overhang, in the sulphurous heat of the ruined rift. It came not as tears, because his body had no moisture to spare for tears, but as a shaking in his chest, and a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a scream. He pressed his fist against his mouth and let it pass through him, a wave that crested and broke and left him gasping on the shore of his own survival. When it was over, he lay still for a while, listening to the silence. The ash had stopped falling entirely. The world was quiet, so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat, a rapid, thready pulse that spoke of dehydration and heat stress and a body approaching its limits. He had to move. Staying here was dying slowly instead of dying quickly. The distinction mattered only in the amount of suffering involved. Davy crawled out from under the overhang and stood. The horizon shimmered. The ash plain stretched out before him, vast and featureless, and impossibly still. Nothing moved. No wind. No animals. No other survivors. He oriented himself northeast and began to walk. The hours blurred. Time lost its meaning in the gray landscape, where every step looked like the last one, and the terrain offered no landmarks to measure progress. He walked with his head down, watching his boots push through the ash, counting steps to keep his mind occupied. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each number was a tiny victory, proof that he was still alive, still moving, still refusing to lie down and let the heat take him. At some point, the ground changed, the ash thinned, and hard rock appeared beneath his feet. He was climbing, the terrain sloping gently upward. He looked up and saw through the haze the outline of structures, angular shapes that did not belong to the natural landscape. Buildings, prefabricated buildings with corrugated metal walls and flat roofs. The mining installation. He tried to run and could not. His legs would not cooperate. He stumbled forward at a pace that was barely faster than his previous walk, his boots scraping on the rocky ground, his arms hanging at his sides. The buildings grew larger, resolved into clearer shapes. He could see a communications tower, its antenna array intact. He could see a water tank, a huge, cylindrical structure standing on metal legs. He could see vehicles parked in a row, covered in ash but apparently undamaged. The installation had survived. He reached the first building and leaned against its wall, pressing his cheek against the metal. It was warm. heated by the volcanic atmosphere. But it was solid. It was real. It was civilization. The door was locked but not reinforced. He found a rock and broke the window beside it. The sound of shattering glass was startlingly loud in the silence, and for a moment he stood frozen, listening to the echoes die. Then he reached through, found the lock, and opened the door. Inside was shade, real shade, the kind that comes with walls and a ceiling and insulation. The temperature was still high, probably 40 degrees, but after the volcanic plane, it felt like stepping into a cold bath. Davi staggered inside and found himself in some kind of administrative office. Desks, chairs, a water cooler in the corner. The water cooler was half full. He fell to his knees in front of it and drank. The water was stale and warm, but it was water, and his body absorbed it like a sponge, each swallow sending a pulse of relief through his desiccated tissues. He drank until his stomach ached, and then he drank a little more, sitting on the floor of the empty office, with water dripping from his chin and the silence of the ash field pressing against the windows. Davi Carell began to plan his next move, the communications tower. If it was still functional, he could broadcast a distress signal. House Davion maintained a garrison on Lockton 4's northern continent. They would come, eventually. But first, he sat, he breathed. He listened to the silence. The ash continued to settle outside, a fine gray powder that coated everything it touched. It filled the footprints he had left in the plane, erasing his path as thoroughly as if he had never walked it. In a few hours, there would be no evidence that anyone had crossed the Kalos Rift at all. Just ash and silence. Somewhere to the south, buried under that ash, were the remains of Corell's Cavaliers. 11 mechs, 11 friends, and one locust, twisted and melted, its pilot entombed in the same gray shroud that covered everything else. Davi closed his eyes. The water cooler hummed faintly, a mechanical sound that was almost like breathing. He thought about the locust pilot again. In another life, in another circumstance, they might have shared a drink in some mercenary bar on a neutral world and swapped stories about the eruption that had nearly killed them both. MechWarriors were like that. The universe was vast, and the community of people who strapped themselves into walking war machines was small. Enemies one day, drinking companions the next. But the Locust pilot had made a choice, and Davi had made a choice, and in the ashen silence between those two choices, someone had to die. He opened his eyes. The office was dim and still. Outside, the volcanic haze was beginning to thin, and through the window he could see the communications tower rising against the sickly sky. He would rest for 10 more minutes. Then he would find the tower's control room. Then he would call for help, but not yet. For now he sat in the silence and breathed and let the fact of his survival settle into his bones like warmth. Not the killing heat of the rift or the slow bake of the cockpit, but a different warmth. The warmth of being alive when everything had tried to make him otherwise. Davi stood. His legs were unsteady, his body a ruin of dehydration and heat damage and exhaustion. but his mind was clear, clearer than it had been since the eruption. He walked out of the office and into the ashen light, and he did not look south.